The evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of the Crooked Creek Ranch as Thomas Blackwood rocked slowly in his chair, squinting at the horizon. At 52, the lines on his face told stories of hardship and triumph in equal measure, each wrinkle earned through 20 years of wrestling a living from the unforgiving Wyoming Territory. His calloused hands absently stroked the gray-flecked beard that had long since replaced the clean-shaven face of his youth, while his eyes, still sharp as a hawk's, scanned the dusty trail leading to his property. The letter had said the new schoolteacher would arrive today, some plain spinster from Boston who'd answered the town council's advertisement. Thomas had grudgingly agreed to provide temporary lodging until the schoolhouse living quarters were finished, a decision he was already beginning to regret. He preferred his solitude, hard-won after years of heartache and loss, and the thought of a stranger disrupting his carefully ordered existence set his teeth on edge. I'd like to take a moment to kindly ask you to subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We love sharing these Western tales with you, and we're curious, what city are you watching from today? Behind him, the ranch house stood as testament to his perseverance. 2 stories of sturdy pine logs harvested from the nearby mountains, with a stone chimney that had weathered 20 Wyoming winters. Inside, his housekeeper, Mrs. Peterson, had been fussing all day, preparing the guest room and cooking enough food to make a proper impression, despite Thomas's insistence that no special effort was necessary. His ranch foreman, Caleb Jenkins, had ridden into town earlier to meet the stagecoach and escort their unwanted visitor to the ranch. The thought of a city woman, with her likely complaints about the dust and isolation, made Thomas drain the last of his whiskey in one burning swallow. The soft nickering of horses drew his attention to the trail, where 2 riders approached through the golden haze of sunset. One was unmistakably Caleb's broad-shouldered silhouette. But the second, smaller figure made Thomas sit up straighter, a strange uneasiness settling in his gut. Something about the way the woman sat her horse struck a chord of familiarity that he couldn't place. As they drew closer, Thomas rose from his chair, his heart suddenly pounding against his ribs with unexpected force. There was something in the graceful way she handled her mount, something in the proud tilt of her head that sent his mind reeling backward through the years. When they reached the hitching post and the woman looked up at the porch, time seemed to stop altogether. The fading sunlight illuminated a face he'd never thought to see again in this lifetime. Older, yes, with fine lines at the corners of those unmistakable green eyes, but still hauntingly beautiful. Her chestnut hair, once worn long and free, was now elegantly pinned beneath a modest traveling hat, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame her face. For a moment, Thomas couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as the ghost of his past dismounted with Caleb's assistance. "Mr. Blackwood," Caleb called out, unaware of the thunderstorm raging in his employer's chest. "May I present Miss Eleanor Montgomery, our new schoolteacher?" The name struck him like a physical blow. Not the same surname he remembered, but there was no mistaking those eyes. The same eyes that had looked up at him with love beneath a Kansas moon 30 years ago. The same eyes that had filled with tears when he'd ridden away to fight in a war that had nearly destroyed them all. Eleanor Montgomery. Once, she had been Eleanor Winters, his first and only love, before life and circumstance had torn them apart. Now she stood at the foot of his porch steps, her composure perfect, but for a slight trembling of her gloved hands. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying the same melodic quality he remembered, though tempered now with a formal politeness that cut him to the quick. "Thank you for your hospitality. I hope my presence won't inconvenience you unduly." Thomas found himself suddenly, acutely aware of his rough appearance, the worn flannel shirt, the dusty boots, the untrimmed beard, as he faced this woman who had once known him as a bright-eyed young man with dreams larger than the Kansas sky. "Miss Montgomery," he finally managed, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "Welcome to Crooked Creek." He descended the steps, moving as if in a dream, and offered his hand to help her up to the porch. When her fingers touched his, even through the barrier of her glove, an electric current seemed to pass between them, a ghost of what had once been. Did she feel it too? Her carefully neutral expression gave nothing away, but he noticed how quickly she withdrew her hand once she reached the top step. Caleb, oblivious to the undercurrents swirling around him, began unloading Eleanor's luggage from the pack horse, a single trunk and two modest valises that contained the sum total of her worldly possessions. "I'll show Miss Montgomery to her room," Thomas heard himself say, though he hadn't consciously decided to speak. "Caleb, see to her horse, and then get yourself some supper. Mrs. Peterson has left a spread in the kitchen." The interior of the ranch house was cool and shadowed after the bright evening outside. The smell of pine and beeswax polish mingling with the lingering aroma of fresh bread and roast beef from the kitchen. Thomas was suddenly, painfully aware of every creaking floorboard, every imperfection in the rough-hewn furniture that filled his home. What would she think of this place, so different from the refined surroundings she must have grown accustomed to? He led her up the narrow staircase to the second floor, hyper-conscious of her presence behind him. "This will be your room," he said, opening a door at the end of the hallway. "It's not much, but it should be comfortable enough." The guest room was the finest in the house, with a brass bed covered in one of Mrs. Peterson's colorful quilts, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a small writing desk positioned beneath the window that overlooked the eastern pastures. The washroom is at the end of the hall. Mrs. Peterson comes in daily to clean and cook, but she doesn't live in. If you need anything during the night," he trailed off, suddenly uncertain what more to say to this woman who was both intimately familiar and completely unknown to him. Eleanor moved past him into the room, removing her gloves with deliberate care. "It's lovely, Mr. Blackwood, more than adequate for my needs." She turned to face him, and for the first time, he caught a glimpse of something beyond the polite facade, a flash of the girl he had known, perhaps in the slight curve of her lips. "I imagine you're surprised to see me." The understatement hung in the air between them, as vast and empty as the prairies surrounding his ranch. What could he possibly say? That not a day had passed in 30 years when he hadn't thought of her? That he had carried the memory of her like a talisman through the blood-soaked battlefields of the Civil War and the hard-scrabble years that followed? Instead, he cleared his throat and said simply, "I wasn't aware that Eleanor Winters had become Eleanor Montgomery." It was as close as he could come, in that moment, to asking the question that burned in his throat. What had happened in the years that separated the girl he had loved from the composed woman who stood before him now? A shadow passed over her face, so quickly he might have imagined it. "Yes, well, life takes unexpected turns for all of us, Mr. Blackwood." She moved to the window, her back to him as she gazed out at the land that had become his sanctuary and prison. "William Montgomery was my husband for 15 years. He passed away 3 winters ago." Husband, The words settled like a stone in Thomas's chest. Of course she had married. What had he expected? That she would have waited for him? When he had been the one to leave, when he had never returned as promised, when the war had changed him so fundamentally that he'd convinced himself she was better off without the broken man he'd become? "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. She nodded without turning. "Thank you. It was a good marriage." Something in the careful way she said it made him wonder, but he had no right to press further. "I'll leave you to settle in. Supper will be ready whenever you are. Just come down when you're ready." As Thomas descended the stairs, his mind reeled with questions. What twist of fate had brought Eleanor to this remote corner of Wyoming territory? Why had she applied for a position in this small L-Bar, hardscrabble town where he had established himself? Was it possible she hadn't known he was here? Unlikely. Crooked Creek wasn't large enough for his name to go unmentioned in the town council's correspondence, which meant she had come here knowingly, deliberately crossing the vast distance that had separated them for decades. But why? His thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Peterson emerging from the kitchen, her round face flushed with exertion and curiosity. "Is she settled then? What's she like, this city teacher?" Before he could formulate a reply that wouldn't reveal too much, a soft footfall on the stairs announced Eleanor's descent. She had removed her traveling clothes and now wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly rearranged, but still pinned up in that unfamiliar style. Mrs. Peterson emerging from the kitchen, her round face flushed with exertion and curiosity. "Is she settled then? What's she like, this city teacher?" Before he could formulate a reply that wouldn't reveal too much, a soft footfall on the stairs announced Eleanor's descent. She had removed her traveling clothes and now wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly rearranged but still pinned up in that unfamiliar style. Mrs. Peterson emerging. She had removed her traveling clothes and now wore a simple blue dress, her hair neatly rearranged but still pinned up in that unfamiliar style. Mrs. Peterson emerging. His thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Peterson emerging from the kitchen, her round face flushed with exertion and curiosity. Before he could formulate a reply that wouldn't reveal too much, a soft foot. Peterson's eyes widened slightly as she took in their guest's refined appearance. A stark Thomas found himself unable to take his eyes from Eleanor's face, searching for glimpses of the young woman he had known in the elegant stranger across his table. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and something electric would pass between them, before one or both looked away. Eleanor answered Mrs. Peterson's questions with gracious politeness, revealing little about herself beyond the basic facts of her teaching experience in Boston following her husband's death. "And what brings you all the way out here, Miss Montgomery?" Mrs. Peterson finally asked, serving apple pie with a generous hand. "Boston to Wyoming is quite a journey for a lady on her own." Thomas found himself holding his breath, awaiting her answer. Eleanor's fingers tensed slightly around her fork, the only indication that the question affected her composure. "I needed a change," she said after a moment, her eyes briefly meeting Thomas's across the table. "The city held too many memories. When I saw the advertisement for a teacher in a growing western town, it seemed like an opportunity to be useful somewhere new." It wasn't a lie, but Thomas knew with bone-deep certainty that it wasn't the complete truth either. There was something she wasn't saying, some reason beyond a simple desire for change that had brought her to his doorstep after all these years. But he couldn't press her, not here, not with Mrs. Peterson's curious eyes upon them. The housekeeper seemed about to ask another question when the front door opened and Caleb stepped inside, his expression urgent. "Boss, you're needed at the north pasture. Some of Hargrove's cattle broke through the fence line, and the hands are having trouble getting them sorted from our herd." Thomas rose immediately, both frustrated by and grateful for the interruption. "Excuse me, ladies. Ranch business. Mrs. Peterson, see that Miss Montgomery has everything she needs. I may be late returning." The night air was cool against his face as Thomas rode toward the north pasture, the familiar rhythm of his horse's gait doing nothing to calm the turmoil in his mind. Eleanor Winters, no, Eleanor Montgomery now, had reappeared in his life like a specter from a past he'd tried desperately to bury. The irony wasn't lost on him. For years after the war, he had fantasized about finding her again, explaining why he hadn't returned, asking her forgiveness. But as time passed and the wounds of war slowly scarred over, he had convinced himself it was better this way. The boy who had loved Eleanor had died on the battlefields of Gettysburg, replaced by a harder, more solitary man who had no right to disrupt the life she must have built without him. And now, here she was, disrupting his carefully constructed solitude instead, bringing with her memories he'd thought safely locked away. The complications with the cattle kept him occupied until well past midnight, a blessing in disguise as physical labor and practical problems temporarily displaced his emotional turmoil. The house was dark when he returned, save for a single lamp burning in the downstairs window. Thomas removed his boots on the porch, not wanting to wake his guest with heavy footfalls. As he entered the dimly lit parlor, he stopped short at the sight of Eleanor seated in his favorite chair by the fireplace, a book open on her lap. She looked up at his entrance, and for a moment, neither spoke, the weight of 3 decades hanging in the air between them. "I couldn't sleep," she finally said, closing her book. "New places always leave me restless." Thomas nodded, understanding all too well the discomfort of strange surroundings. He had spent too many nights during and after the war, bedded down in unfamiliar territory. "Would you like something? Tea, perhaps? Or something stronger?" he offered, moving toward the cabinet where he kept his whiskey. She hesitated, then nodded. "Something stronger, I think. The occasion seems to call for it." The occasion? Their unexpected reunion after 30 years of silence. Thomas poured 2 glasses of whiskey, noting with approval that Eleanor didn't flinch or demur when he handed her a measure equal to his own. Some Eastern ladies would have considered it improper, but Eleanor had never been conventional, even in their youth. She took a sip, her composure perfect, except for the slight whitening of her knuckles around the glass. "You're wondering why I came here," she said without preamble, her directness another echo of the girl he had known. Thomas settled into the chair opposite hers, the familiar burn of whiskey doing little to steady his nerves. "The thought had crossed my mind," he admitted. She studied her glass for a long moment before meeting his eyes. "Would you believe me if I said it was coincidence? That I had no idea Thomas Blackwood of Crooked Creek, Wyoming was the same boy I knew in Kansas?" Her tone was light, almost teasing, but her eyes held a challenge. "No," he answered honestly. "I wouldn't believe that for a moment." A smile flitted across her face, there and gone, like summer lightning. "No, I didn't think you would." She took another sip of whiskey, seeming to gather her thoughts. "When I saw your name in the town council's letter, I almost declined the position outright. It seemed too much, too painful to face you after all this time." Thomas's heart constricted at her words. Painful. Yes, that was the word for the ache that had lived beneath his ribs since the day he'd ridden away from her father's farm, promising to return once the war was over. "What changed your mind?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Eleanor's gaze drifted to the dying embers in the fireplace. Curiosity, perhaps, or the fact that I'm 50 years old and tired of running from ghosts. She looked back at him, and for the first time, he saw naked emotion in her expression. "Maybe I just wanted to know if you ever regretted not coming back." The question hung between them like smoke, impossible to ignore or wave away. Thomas set down his glass, the weight of truth too heavy to bear with false courage borrowed from whiskey. "Every day," he said, the words scraping his throat raw. "Every day for 30 years, Eleanor." Her breath caught audibly, and he watched as she blinked rapidly, composing herself with visible effort. "Then why?" she asked, the two simple words containing decades of hurt. Thomas looked down at his hands, weathered now, marked with the scars and calluses of a hard life, so different from the smooth hands of the young man who had held hers beneath a blossoming apple tree and promised to return. "After Gettysburg," he began, then stopped, the memories still too sharp despite the passage of time. "I wasn't the same man who left Kansas. I was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. You deserved better than what was left of me." Eleanor's laugh held no humor, only a brittle edge that cut him to the quick. "How noble of you to decide what I deserved without consulting me." She set down her glass with deliberate care. "Did it ever occur to you, Thomas, that I might have wanted to make that choice for myself?" The accusation in her voice was justified, he knew. In his youthful arrogance, he had made a decision that altered both their lives without giving her any say in the matter. "I wrote to you," he said quietly. "After Gettysburg, I told you that I was releasing you from any promises, that you should find happiness with someone who could give you the life you deserved." He had written that letter from a field hospital, his hands still stained with the blood of men who had been his friends, his soul numb with the horrors he had witnessed. "I never received any such letter," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with decades-old hurt. "The last I heard from you was a brief note saying you were well and heading into Pennsylvania with your regiment. Then, nothing. For months, I waited, checking with every rider who passed through. When the war ended and you still didn't return." Thomas stared at her, a cold realization dawning. "You never got my letter." It wasn't a question, but a statement of a truth that changed everything he had believed about their separation. "I waited 6 months after Appomattox," Eleanor continued, her voice steadier now. "Then my father died. The farm was sold to pay his debts, and I had no choice but to accept my aunt's invitation to Boston. That's where I met William." The simple narrative of how their lives had diverged hung in the air between them, a tragedy of missed connections and misunderstandings worthy of Shakespeare. "If I had known," Thomas said, his voice barely audible, "if I had known you never received my letter, would it have changed anything? Would you have waited longer?" The question was unfair, he knew, but he couldn't help asking it. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the lamp. "I can't answer that, Thomas. It's a path we never walked." She rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts with hands that trembled slightly. "It's late, and tomorrow will be a busy day. Thank you for the whiskey." Sleep eluded Thomas that night as he lay in his bed, staring at the familiar patterns of moonlight on his ceiling. Eleanor was under his roof, breathing the same air, separated from him by just a hallway and 30 years of separate lives. The revelation that she had never received his letter from Gettysburg plagued him with thoughts of what might have been. Had the letter been lost in the chaos of war, deliberately intercepted by someone who wished to separate them? Or had he, in his pain-addled state, only imagined writing it? No, he remembered too clearly the effort it had taken to form each word, the teardrops that had fallen on the paper as he released her from promises made in a more innocent time. Somewhere between the blood-soaked fields of Pennsylvania and the sunflower-dotted plains of Kansas, his words of farewell had vanished, leaving Eleanor to believe he had simply abandoned her without explanation. The cruelty of it, however unintentional, made him ache with regret for all the years they had lost. Morning arrived with the familiar sounds of the ranch awakening. Roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distant pastures, the clatter of Mrs. Peterson arriving to prepare breakfast. Thomas dressed with unusual care, trimming his beard and selecting a clean shirt before descending to face the day and the woman who had upended his carefully ordered existence. He found Eleanor already in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Peterson prepare biscuits. Her hair once again neatly pinned and her manner composed, as if their midnight conversation had never occurred. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him, her tone perfectly polite. "Mrs. Peterson has been telling me about the schoolhouse. It seems I'll have around 15 students of varying ages." Thomas nodded, taking the cup of coffee Mrs. Peterson offered him. "The town's growing, more families arriving every month. The council felt it was time for a proper school, not just lessons in someone's parlor." He studied Eleanor over the rim of his cup, wondering how this refined Boston lady would adapt to teaching frontier children, many of whom had never set foot in a formal classroom. "Caleb will take you into town after breakfast," Thomas said, watching as Eleanor competently helped serve the morning meal. "The school board is eager to meet you, and you'll want to see the schoolhouse before classes begin next week." Eleanor nodded, a determined expression crossing her face. "Yes, I'm looking forward to it. Mrs. Peterson mentioned that the living quarters attached to the schoolhouse won't be ready for another 2 weeks." She glanced at Thomas, a question in her eyes. "That's right," he confirmed, suddenly aware of what her question implied. 2 more weeks of Eleanor under his roof, 2 more weeks of navigating the complicated emotions her presence evoked. "You're welcome to stay here until then," he added, though they both knew she had no other option in a town where the only alternative was the small hotel above the saloon. Hardly a suitable residence for the new schoolteacher. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll try not to intrude on your routine any more than necessary." The ride into town with Caleb gave Eleanor her first real look at the community she would call home. Crooked Creek had grown significantly since Thomas had first staked his claim 20 years earlier. From a handful of determined settlers to a proper town with a main street lined with businesses, a general store, a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a small hotel, a barber shop that doubled as a dentist's office, and now a new schoolhouse at the far end of the street. The steepled building stood apart from the others, freshly painted white, with a bell tower that would soon call children to learning. Beside it, a smaller structure was under construction, her future living quarters. As Caleb helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store, Eleanor found herself the center of attention, with townspeople pausing in their activities to study the new arrival. Word traveled fast in small communities, and by the time they reached the store's entrance, the proprietor was already holding the door open with an anticipatory smile. "Miss Montgomery, welcome to Crooked Creek. The portly shopkeeper introduced himself as Howard Simmons, also the head of the school board. Within minutes, Eleanor found herself surrounded by curious townsfolk, each eager to meet the teacher who had traveled all the way from Boston to educate their children. Among them was Jeremiah Hargrove, owner of the neighboring ranch, and, as Eleanor quickly discerned from the tension in Caleb's posture, something of a rival to Thomas. "Miss Montgomery," Hargrove said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "A pleasure to make your acquaintance. Interesting that Tom Blackwood didn't bring you into town himself. Not very hospitable of him." The implication was clear. Hargrove was attempting to use her arrival to cast Thomas in a negative light. Eleanor's spine stiffened at the transparent ploy. "Mr. Blackwood has been the very model of hospitality," she replied coolly. "And I understand from Mrs. Peterson that ranch work doesn't stop for social niceties. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm eager to see the schoolhouse." The schoolhouse exceeded her expectations, with rows of new desks, a fine blackboard, and bookshelves that were surprisingly well stocked for a frontier town. "The Ladies' Auxiliary raised funds for books," explained Martha Simmons, the shopkeeper's wife. "We want our children to have advantages, even out here." Eleanor ran her fingers over the spines of the volumes. Basic readers, arithmetic primers, histories, even a few classics of literature. She could work with this, she thought, already envisioning how she would arrange lessons for students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age. The attached living quarters, though still unfinished, promised to be comfortable enough. 2 rooms and a small kitchen, simple but private. "It's not what you're used to in Boston, I expect," Martha said, watching Eleanor's face for signs of disappointment. Eleanor smiled, thinking of the constraints and expectations that had defined her life in the East. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. "Exactly what I needed." The return to the ranch that afternoon found Thomas in the corral, breaking a spirited young stallion that danced and bucked beneath him with wild determination. Eleanor paused at the fence, watching the contest of wills with a mixture of admiration and concern. Thomas sat the horse with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle, his movements fluid, as he anticipated each attempt the animal made to unseat him. It was a side of him she hadn't seen in their brief reunion. The capable rancher, the man who had built something substantial from nothing in this harsh territory. The Thomas she had known in Kansas had been a boy full of dreams and poetry. This Thomas was all hard edges and practical skill, forged by experiences she could only imagine. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, their eyes meeting across the corral. In that moment of distraction, the stallion gave a particularly violent buck that nearly succeeded in throwing its rider. Thomas recovered quickly, but not before Eleanor had gasped, her hands tightening on the fence rail. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Eleanor found herself studying Thomas's profile, comparing the man beside her to the boy she had loved. The bones of his face were the same, the strong jaw, the straight nose, but life had etched deeper lines around his eyes and mouth, had sprinkled silver through his once dark hair. When he turned to catch her looking at him, she didn't glance away, as propriety might have dictated. Instead, she asked the question that had been on her mind since watching him in the corral. "Are you happy here, Thomas? With the life you've built?" He seemed surprised by the direct inquiry, taking a moment to consider his answer. "Content, maybe. I'm not sure I remember what happy feels like." The honest admission hung in the twilight air between them. "The ranch is successful. I have good men working for me. There's satisfaction in that. But no family," Eleanor observed softly. "No wife, no children." It wasn't a judgment, merely an acknowledgement of the solitary nature of the life he had chosen. Thomas's hands tightened slightly on the arms of his rocking chair. "No, there was never," he cleared his throat. "After you, it didn't seem possible to feel that way again." The simple statement stole Eleanor's breath. She had expected many things upon seeing Thomas again. Anger, perhaps, or cool indifference, or the awkward politeness of former sweethearts who had long since moved on with their lives. She hadn't expected this raw honesty, this admission that her memory had shaped his choices just as his had influenced hers. "William was a good man," she said after a long moment, feeling she owed him this truth in exchange for his. "Kind, steady. He gave me security when I had none, and I was fond of him. But he knew he wasn't my first choice. He knew there had been someone before." The admission cost her, even after all these years. William Montgomery had deserved better than a wife who could offer respect and friendship, but never the full measure of her heart. Thomas was silent for so long that Eleanor wondered if she had said too much, crossed some invisible boundary in their careful dance of rediscovery. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I told myself you would find someone worthy of you, someone whole. It helped, somehow, to imagine you happy." Eleanor's laugh held a touch of bitterness. How ironic, then, that we were both picturing the other's happiness while denying ourselves the same. She rose from her chair, suddenly unable to sit still with the weight of what might have been pressing on her chest. "I should check my lesson plans for tomorrow. The school board has arranged for me to meet some of the children before classes officially begin." It was a retreat, and they both knew it, but Thomas nodded, allowing her the space to withdraw from a conversation that had veered too close to still tender wounds. The next morning, Eleanor rode into town with Caleb again, grateful for the taciturn foreman's lack of curiosity about the undercurrents between her and his employer. Her meeting with the prospective students and their parents occupied most of the day, giving her little time to dwell on personal matters as she assessed reading levels, mathematical abilities, and the general education needs of the community's children. She was impressed by their eagerness to learn, many having had only sporadic schooling from parents or older siblings until now. By the time Caleb arrived to take her back to the ranch, Eleanor had formed a clear plan for organizing her classroom and curriculum, her mind buzzing with possibilities despite her physical exhaustion. The children's enthusiasm had reminded her why she had chosen teaching as her second career after William's death, when the quiet emptiness of their Boston home had threatened to suffocate her. Here was purpose, a chance to shape young minds and perhaps leave something of value behind in a world that had not given her the family she had once dreamed of having with Thomas. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Eleanor would ride into town with Caleb in the mornings to prepare her classroom and meet with parents, returning to the ranch in the evenings where she and Thomas would share supper, sometimes with Mrs. Peterson present, sometimes alone when the housekeeper needed to return home before dark. Those private meals were both torment and treasure, opportunities to rediscover each other as the adults they had become, colored always by the awareness of what had been lost. They spoke of safe topics at first, books they had read, places they had seen, the changes in the country since the war. Gradually, the conversations deepened, venturing into more personal territory. Eleanor learned of Thomas's difficult years immediately following the war, when he had drifted westward, working as a cowhand and occasionally as a lawman, before finally staking his claim in Wyoming. Thomas, in turn, heard about Eleanor's life in Boston society as the wife of a respected merchant, her childless marriage, and her eventual turn to teaching after William's death. "You never had children?" Thomas asked one evening as they sat in the parlor, the question tentative, as if he wasn't certain he had the right to ask such a personal thing. Eleanor shook her head, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on the arm of her chair. "We tried in the early years. After a time, the doctors said it wasn't to be." The old grief touched her voice, softened by time, but never entirely absent. "William was disappointed, though he never blamed me. His sister had several children, and she doted on his nieces and nephews." She smiled slightly at the memory. "He would have been a wonderful father." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "And you would have been an extraordinary mother." The simple statement, offered without pity or platitude, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Thank you for that," she said quietly. "I've made my peace with it, mostly. Teaching helps, all those young minds to nurture, even if they aren't my own." As the days passed, Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to the rhythms of ranch life. She began rising earlier, joining Thomas for coffee on the porch, as the sun painted the eastern sky in delicate hues of pink and gold. Sometimes they would talk, continuing some conversation from the previous evening. Other times they would sit in companionable silence, watching as the ranch hands began their daily tasks in the distance. On the weekend, when there was no school preparation to be done, Thomas offered to show her more of his property. They rode together across rolling pastureland, through stands of aspen whose leaves trembled like gold coins in the breeze, and up to a ridge that offered views across the valley to the snow-capped mountains beyond. "It's breathtaking," Eleanor said, reining her horse to a stop beside his. "No wonder you stayed." Thomas nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape with proprietary pride. "Took me 5 years to save enough for the first parcel. Another 15 to build it to what you see now. Land was cheaper then, and I got lucky with some early cattle sales." "You built something remarkable," Eleanor said, meaning it sincerely. The ranch was a testament to Thomas's vision and tenacity, far greater than anything they might have achieved as young lovers in Kansas. Would she have had the strength to stand beside him through those difficult early years, she wondered, or would she have crumbled under the hardships of frontier life? It was impossible to know, another of the many what-ifs that haunted their interactions. Thomas turned to look at her, something unreadable in his expression. It would have been different sharing it with someone. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Yes," she agreed, "it would have been." Neither of them specified who that someone might have been, but they both knew. The moment stretched, taut with possibility, until Thomas finally looked away, gesturing toward a distant meadow. "There's a creek down there with some of the best trout fishing in the territory. Would you like to see it?" The day before Eleanor was due to move into her quarters at the schoolhouse, a late summer thunderstorm rolled through the valley, bringing with it sheets of driving rain that turned the roads into rivers of mud and made travel impossible. Thomas found her at the window, watching as lightning split the darkened sky. "I've sent word to town that you won't be moving today," he said, coming to stand beside her. "The wagon would get stuck before we made it halfway." Eleanor nodded, a strange mixture of disappointment and relief washing through her. The past 2 weeks at the ranch had created a tenuous new connection between them, fragile but precious. Once she moved to town, their interactions would necessarily become more limited, governed by the proprieties expected of a schoolteacher and a prominent local rancher. "Thank you for making arrangements," she said, watching as rain lashed the window panes. "I hope the delay won't inconvenience you." Thomas's reflection in the glass showed the hint of a smile. "Having you here has never been an inconvenience, Eleanor." That evening, with thunder still rumbling in the distance and rain drumming steadily on the roof, they sat closer to the fireplace than usual, the storm having brought an unseasonable chill to the air. Peterson had left them a cold supper before hurrying home ahead of the weather, leaving them truly alone for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. The intimacy of the setting was not lost on either of them as Thomas poured them each a measure of whiskey, the firelight casting their faces in warm gold and deep shadow. "When do you think you'll be able to move tomorrow?" Eleanor asked, taking a small sip from her glass. Thomas studied the amber liquid in his own glass before answering. "The roads dry quickly here. By mid-morning, it should be passable." He looked up at her, something vulnerable in his expression. "Unless you'd prefer to wait another day, you'd be welcome to stay longer." The invitation hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Eleanor set down her glass carefully, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. "Thomas," she began, then hesitated, uncertain how to articulate the complicated emotions that had been building within her over the past 2 weeks. "I didn't come to Crooked Creek to disrupt your life, or to revisit old hurts." It was only partly true, she knew. Some part of her had been seeking closure, perhaps, or answers to questions that had haunted her for decades. What she hadn't expected was this rekindling of feelings she had believed long extinguished. Thomas leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes never leaving her face. "Why did you come then?" he asked softly. "The truth, Eleanor. After 30 years, I think we owe each other at least that much." The directness of the question, the gentle challenge in his tone, broke something loose inside her, a dam of careful composure that had held back her truest feelings for too long. "Because I never stopped wondering," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the patter of rain and the crackle of the fire. "Because after William died, when I was finally free to choose my own path, without obligation or expectation, I found myself thinking of you, wondering what had become of the boy who promised to return to me." She met his gaze squarely, drawing courage from the intensity she saw reflected there. "When I saw your name in the town council's letter, it seemed like fate, perhaps. A chance to know, finally, what might have been." Thomas's breath caught audibly at her confession. He set aside his glass and rose from his chair, crossing the short distance between them to kneel at her side. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he took her hands in his. The calluses on his palms rasped gently against her softer skin, a tactile reminder of the different lives they had led. "And now that you're here?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Now that you've seen the man I became?" Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, his large and weathered, hers smaller, but marked with their own signs of work and age. Not the smooth young hands that had once reached for each other with such innocent passion, but hands that had experienced life in all its complexity. "I find," she said carefully, "that I'm still wondering, still curious about what might be, rather than what might have been." Thomas's fingers tightened around hers, and when she looked up, his face was closer than before, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Eleanor," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "May I?" He couldn't finish the question, but he didn't need to. Eleanor nodded once, her heart pounding as Thomas leaned in and with exquisite gentleness pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief, tentative, a question more than a demand. When he pulled back to gauge her reaction, Eleanor raised a hand to his cheek, her fingers brushing against the roughness of his beard. "We're not the same people we were in Kansas," she whispered, needing him to understand that she harbored no illusions about recapturing their youthful romance. "No," he agreed, turning his face to press a kiss into her palm. "We're not. We've both been shaped by joy and sorrow, by choices made and paths not taken." His eyes held hers, steady and certain. "But I find that I like the woman you've become, Eleanor Montgomery. I like her very much indeed." The simple declaration, free from the florid sentiments of youth, but no less sincere for its plainness, warmed her from within. This was not the headlong rush of first love, but something deeper, more considered, a recognition between two souls who had found their way back to each other against all odds. "And I," she replied with equal honesty, "find much to admire in Thomas Blackwood, rancher and builder of dreams." A smile touched his lips at her words, and he rose, drawing her to her feet alongside him. "It's late," he said, though neither of them felt the least bit tired despite the hour. "And tomorrow will bring changes, whether we're ready or not." The morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean and left behind a sky of impossible blue. Eleanor stood on the porch, watching as Thomas and Caleb loaded her trunk and valises into the wagon that would take her to her new home in town. Last night's kiss and the tender conversation that followed had changed something fundamental between them, opening a door neither had expected to pass through again. They had not spoken of the future directly. Both were too wary of fate's cruel tricks to make grand pronouncements, but there had been an unspoken agreement to explore this unexpected second chance with cautious hope. As Thomas approached the porch, dusting off his hands, Eleanor felt a flutter of nerves that reminded her, incongruously, of their first meeting all those decades ago at a harvest dance in Kansas. He had been so handsome then, so full of charm and dreams, asking her to dance with a confidence that belied his 17 years. Now he stood before her, a man of 52, weathered by life, but no less compelling for the changes time had wrought. "Ready?" he asked, offering his hand to help her down the steps. Eleanor nodded, placing her gloved fingers in his with a trust that went beyond the simple gesture. "As ready as I'll ever be to face 30 children on Monday morning," she replied with a smile, trying for lightness despite the significance of the moment. Thomas chuckled, the sound warning her, even as the practical part of her mind noted that she had rarely heard him laugh during her stay. "They won't know what hit them," he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Miss Eleanor Montgomery from Boston is going to turn Crooked Creek into the most educated town in the territory." His teasing held a note of genuine admiration that made Eleanor's cheeks warm with pleasure. As they reached the wagon, he surprised her by lifting her easily onto the seat, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "I'll be driving you today," he said, answering her unspoken question. Caleb has other duties to attend to. The ride into town passed too quickly, filled with comfortable conversation about her plans for the school and his for the coming cattle drive. Neither mentioned the previous night's kiss or what it might mean for their future, but it hung between them like a promise, coloring every word and glance with new significance. When they reached the newly completed quarters behind the schoolhouse, Thomas insisted on carrying her belongings inside himself, waving away the offers of help from curious onlookers. The rooms were small but well constructed, with windows that caught the morning light and simple, sturdy furniture provided by the town council. "It's lovely," Eleanor said, genuinely pleased with her new home despite its modest size. "Perfect for my needs." Thomas set down her trunk in the bedroom, his tall frame making the space seem even smaller than it was. Standing there, in what would be her private domain, he suddenly seemed uncertain, as if unsure of his place in this new chapter of her life. "Will you come to supper on Sunday?" he asked, the invitation surprising them both with its directness. "At the ranch. Mrs. Peterson makes a fine roast." The request bridged the gap between their past and potential future, acknowledging that their connection would continue beyond the confines of their 2 weeks under the same roof. Eleanor smiled, relief and happiness mingling in her chest. "I'd like that very much," she replied, watching as the tension eased from his shoulders. Thomas nodded, satisfied, then surprised her again by stepping forward and taking both her hands in his. "I won't pretend that this is simple, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and earnest. "We're not young lovers anymore, with all of life stretching before us. We're two people with histories, habits, separate lives built over decades." His thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands as he spoke. "But if you're willing, I'd like to discover what might be possible between us now. Not what might have been, but what could be." The honesty of his proposal, for that was what it was in its way, touched Eleanor deeply. There were no flowery declarations of undying love, no dramatic promises to sweep her off her feet. Instead, Thomas offered something far more valuable, a clear-eyed acknowledgement of their complicated past, and an invitation to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. "I think," she said carefully, wanting to match his candor with her own, "that would be a journey worth taking. Slowly, with patience and care." Thomas's smile transformed his face, erasing years of solitude and showing her a glimpse of the boy she had loved beneath the man he had become. "Patience I have in abundance," he said, lifting her hands to press a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "And as for care," his eyes held hers, filled with a warmth that promised healing for old wounds. "I believe we've both learned the cost of carelessness with precious things." As Thomas reluctantly took his leave, promising to send someone to check on her the following day, Eleanor stood in the doorway of her new home, watching his wagon until it disappeared down the dusty main street of Crooked Creek. Her heart felt lighter than it had in years, perhaps decades, buoyed by the unexpected gift of a second chance. She had come to Wyoming seeking answers, closure, perhaps even a kind of revenge for the abandonment she had believed she suffered. Instead, she had found Thomas Blackwood, not the boy who had left her, but the man who had carried her in his heart through all the intervening years, just as she had carried him in hers. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility, a new trail to be blazed by two people who had finally found their way back to each other, across the vast wilderness of time and circumstance. Eleanor smiled as she turned back to her rooms, ready to begin arranging her belongings and preparing for her first official day of school. There would be challenges ahead, adjustments to make, a community to navigate. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eleanor Montgomery looked toward tomorrow with something that felt remarkably like hope. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.